very much. I'll just share my screen. The topic is new ways to assess the lung and how to train the mass market to do it. The first thing is ultrasound does not penetrate air, and the chest, of course, is full of air. The question then is there no point in doing lung ultrasound? Logically, that would make sense, wouldn't it? But that's not right. What I'm showing you here on the left panel is an ultrasound of the chest, and on the bottom here you see the diaphragm, this white line coming here. It's moving because the patient is breathing. This wedge-shaped piece of tissue is actually the lower lobe of that lung, which used to fill this entire space. Here is the heart beating in the distance. What this is like a sponge being squashed. That lung used to be full of air predominantly, and that has now collapsed. All the alveoli are no longer full of air, which is why it looks like a piece of soft tissue, and it is small. The black is actually fluid. It looks black because the ultrasound penetrates the fluid without any reflections, and it makes it easy to see these other structures. Again, you can see the collapsed lung here, which is very small compared to the space it used to occupy. We can measure that volume really easily. If you had a horizontal line from the diaphragm to the junction between where the collapsed lung and the remaining lung is, and you measure that in centimeters and multiply that by 200, you end up with a volume, 1,200 mils in this case. And that's about within 10% or 15% or so of reality. Bear in mind that the foot is on the left side of the screen and the head is on the right-hand side of the screen. So in fact, this horizontal line is actually the vertical height of that fluid if someone's sitting in the bed. The common clinical scenario, even as it is today, is to use the stethoscope. Now, this is the original stethoscope in some Paris museum. It's now 203 years old. This is a current generation cardiology Littmann stethoscope. Both of them amplify sound a little bit. This was pretty much completely useless, and this one isn't much better. Why is that? Well, even in the hands of a skilled expert, say of examining the lung or the heart, you're barely able to get a 50-50 hit-miss ratio between what is correct and what isn't in terms of diagnosis. Some things are impossible to assess, such as the diastolic heart failure. If we turn to the chest X-ray, it's pretty obvious that it's not nearly as accurate as a CT scan. But I'm here to tell you tonight that in some areas in particular, the ultrasound is much more accurate than the chest X-ray. The chest X-ray has generally got a high sensitivity. That is to say, if something is there, it can correctly diagnose it. But it has quite a poor specificity. That is, it misses a lot. It's quite poor at discriminating the milder end of the spectrum. And at the lower end of the left chest, the heart is also present, of course, and the two overlying shadows interfere and make interpretation very difficult. So what's changing? Ultrasound isn't exactly new. In fact, ultrasound of the chest isn't exactly new. It was really first pioneered in the 1970s. What's really changing the dynamic is the advent of small portable machines. Here you see on the right-hand side a General Electric V-Scan, which, as you can see, looks a bit like a flip phone. It has a probe, and that's about 80 years old or so. The latest generation of technology is this one here, the Butterfly, which connects directly into your smartphone. The second part of this revolution, particularly relevant to COVID, is that the entire ultrasound machine, the display control and the probe, can fit inside a conventional sterile sheath that we might normally use for inserting sterile catheters and so forth. Now this image on the left is another ultrasound of the chest. These black stripes are actually shadows cast by the bone of the ribs where the ultrasound doesn't penetrate, just like a shadow from the sun on a tree. These very bright white lines are what we refer to as B lines. And here in the still you can see fairly wide lines reaching the far extremity of the screen. This is the typical appearance of people with acute pulmonary edema or heart failure causing fluid on the lungs. On the right panel, you see the diaphragm on the left with the organ underneath. The lung itself looks like soft tissue. It's not full of air, and there's been minimal volume loss. So the alveoli here are still mostly preserved in size, but they're full of fluid, whether that's fluid from the heart cause or fluid from pus, from a pneumonia and so forth, is hard to tell on the ultrasound, but this was a case of pneumonia. So in the age of COVID-19, which is the part topic of tonight, how can lung ultrasound have a major impact? And I can tell you that only 2 days ago, there was a paper in press that was being discussed with me where between the first and the second COVID testing, the first one being negative, the second one being positive, lung ultrasound had detected lung abnormalities. So it is extraordinarily sensitive. So what we have proposed is that if somebody was in a screening scenario and the lung ultrasound was completely normal, there is no evidence of a respiratory problem like a pneumonia necessarily present, and one can discharge them. But any finding at all would suggest that there is some lung inflammation, and given that COVID is primarily, in the first instance, a respiratory infection, then that would make you think of things being in a quite different light. At the very least, you would have them come back and attend as an outpatient for review. If they're more advanced, you would certainly consider bringing them into hospital because their prospects of deterioration are far higher. And then there is a small subset of those where advanced usage can be used to optimize the ventilation in the ICU. Now, in these series here on the left, you can see a small organ. This is the left side, so that is the spleen. And there's this back and forth shadowing here. The patient is breathing. This is the edge of the lung, and this is gas in the bowel. On the right-hand side, the organ is much bigger, which is, of course, the liver. So what's going on? Well, to return to the original, the ultrasound does not penetrate air. And so if we go and look at those pictures again, what you see is an edge of this shadow, and then you can see normal tissues beyond it. That edge means that everything below this surface area is uninterpretable. If we were to plot where the diaphragm might be going, it would be through this area, but you can't see it because this wedge of lung is overlying it between the probe and the structure. This is what normal looks like. Here's another example with a higher frequency probe looking at the chest wall and the beginning of the lung. At the surface, you see the skin and the fat, and all of these other shadows are in the pectoralis muscles of the chest wall. This shadow and this shadow are two adjacent ribs, and this is the intercostal muscle layer. So the pleural aspect, the edge of the lung and the chest wall, is here. Now, if you look carefully, you'll see that there are little shadows of light every now and then, and there is definitely the appearance of movement at this junction. On the other hand, this image, there is no apparent movement. Now, you might say, well, okay, this is fairly subtle. I'm not overly convinced. But I can assure you that after fairly minimal training, people can confidently pick the difference. But there is another way of interpreting these images, and that's with M mode. M mode is where you take a cursor and you place it, and it plots the depth of all of these lines and follows them over time. So for example, this bright white line is actually this line here, which is followed over time, and the one below is this one here. The chest wall, or the pleura, is this one here. Now, because these structures don't vary their depth at all over time, or necessarily much over time, these lines look straight, a bit like waves in the ocean heading towards the beach. On the other hand, this area here is constantly being disrupted. And so this gives you the appearance that looks a bit like sand on the beach. This is the so-called seashore sign. This is normal. But if we were to apply this to a pneumothorax, that is to say, there's air between the lung and the chest wall, then the chest wall aspect remains the same from there to there, but the appearance beyond the pleural line looks different. Long streaky lines. The early people said it looked like the clouds, wispy clouds in the sky. More recently, people prefer the barcode on your Safeway goods. So that's otherwise known as the stratosphere or the barcode sign. Here are an example of a few of the current generation smaller machines. And you can kind of see that there's a bit of an evolution from the kind of laptop level machine to the Android tablet machine to the phone machine. There's not necessarily all of these are exactly wearable, and there's only one that's cloud connected at present. But you can see where the technology is basically heading. And that's leading to this paradigm shift. Exactly like the smartphone or the watch, the idea that you have something that's wearable really is what's going to radically revolutionize practice. That is to say, it's routinely carried on you, the person, in your pocket, and always immediately available. You don't have to go to the end of the ward to grab some big machine. You don't have to beg, grovel, and scrape to somebody else to get a machine from another ward and so forth. Obviously, it needs to be battery powered. You need some sort of sophisticated control. And usually that means in the form of a smartphone with your touch screen. And ideally, you have just one probe that does everything. The connected bit allows you to archive and retrieve at any time, anywhere. One of the big problems of hospitals is actually the notion that you have to be only within the hospital, either for IT security reasons or for privacy reasons or the like. That, in theory, protects the patient more, but the lack of information sharing between people, the doctors, the nurses, about the patient is the unsaid negative. The easy sharing, of course, requires the smartphone pretty much, and the real-time sharing would require some smartphone technology. Of course, there are privacy considerations and electronic medical record integrations considerations. So I mentioned before the butterfly, and this may well be another stepwise revolution in the whole process. Now, normally ultrasound probes are single shafts of crystal tightly packed together and individually connected to an energy source. And by increasing or decreasing the energy source, you can change the frequency of vibration a little bit, but it's fairly minimal. Here, the way of making ultrasound technology has been radically altered. Little discs placed on a computer chip generate the ultrasound waves. And this allows a far greater range of frequencies. For now, this is the first probe to allow all applications with the full frequency range to be able to be performed with just one probe. And another feature that they have introduced on the software side is pretty neat, and I think also likely to have a significant impact clinically. What you see here is somebody doing a scan with the probe, using the phone, and with their teleguidance set up, they can see the image in the bottom half of the screen. But in the top half of the screen, they can see what they are looking at. You see the context, you can see where the probe is. That's using the forward-facing camera of the phone. And it has integrated video conferencing functionality. So perhaps the expert at the other end of this, which is remote, can then open it on a computer and see the scan and the context and conduct a live to and fro discussion, and with a special tool illustrate how that probe should move in order to better optimize the image, or in a clinical context, get more information if it's not fully available. So what's the biggest barrier? Well, the way we see it is that the great spread of ultrasound will be because the majority of people purchasing this great gear will be novices, not the experts. And they don't know how to use it at the beginning. So they need to be taught. They also need to be taught in order to maximize the effectiveness of the technology. And they need to be taught in order to interpret it in a safe manner. So segue quickly into our mass education, which forms the second part of this talk. And I'll preface that by saying the distribution is important as the product. So the product is the education, and how you get it out to them is the distribution. Now, in March of this year, the Dean of Medicine at Melbourne put out a call to provide courses for COVID education, free and paid, and we responded. In fact, we responded quite dramatically by releasing, in collaboration with quite a number of other people, 8 COVID courses. The first one was released at the beginning of April, and the last one by the beginning of May. So it shows you that we developed some of these courses in the space of 1 to 2 weeks, or in some cases 4 or 5 weeks. These are quite large courses, some of them, and normally this would take at least 6 to 12 months. So the scalability of the technology, the automation of the processes, including enrollments, and the various social media advertising were all integral. The result of that was, by the end of the first week of May, we had 10,000 enrollments from this blast. There was a very strong relationship to our advertising campaign, and at one point we were actually taking 5 or 6 enrollments a minute. The most popular course was this one, the COVID-19 lung ultrasound course, which was distributed free. About 80% were taken up by people overseas, and about 20% from those in Australia. We've had about 8,500 enrollments. Another very popular one was the upskilling course for nurses for critical care management in response to the COVID, on the expectation that we were going to be deluged like New York or London. Communicating COVID was another popular one, in ethics. To give you some context of where we're coming from, our people, our team is about 15 or so. In fact, it's slightly less than that. Our main system we use is salesforce.com at the back end. And at this stage, because of the COVID-19, they were all working from home. So you can imagine that there was a considerable pressure of getting courses out, considerable pressure on the new circumstances in which we found ourselves. And all in all, it was rather a busy time. The back end, the assessments and the case studies, which I'll discuss a bit later, we were doing at that time about 15,000 a week, or more than 2,000 a day, indicating the scalability of our platform. Now, we've been in this e-learning space since 2003, really before e-learning. had been coined. And our pedagogy of this is as follows, basically. You need to break learning down into small modular elements that typically should take no more than about 10 or 15 minutes to do. And that's predicated on the idea that most people will pick up a device, read for a bit like they might their emails and put it down again, come back, put it down, come back, put it down. The notion of people having a 2-hour study block to get their study done just frankly doesn't exist anymore. I'm not sure how much it used to exist, but it certainly doesn't exist now. So it's crucial to be able to have small elements. But there's another element that's really important. That is, your comprehension is better. We organize these modular blocks into content, example, reinforcement, and assessment. This is the interactive element. This is providing relevance to that. And then we have another section, which is case scenarios, which really tests across multiple learning units. And I'll discuss that a bit more later. The principle is the more often and the more active that you process knowledge, the better the comprehension, the better the retention. Now, in our distribution model and our product model, we've decided that the best way to go is to have a common platform that did both the content creation and the consumption. That way, a lot of the publishing element, which is quite a substantial one when you think about our existing platform, where we have about 100 courses, is significant. Whereas if you could just write the content and go publish, click, done, it's an enormous efficiency. This is what it looks like to log on with our current generation platform, which is still in development and we're just rolling it out now. You log on to the web technology based. You can see your courses and so forth, some additional ancillary information. But to the author, how does it look? Well, you can see a set of learning units which are identified here under this tutorial. Each learning unit has multiple elements, as I said before, but in each box is some text, for example, and it's a multimedia and so forth. Each of these boxes of text is essentially a separate document. So a course might have 500 or even 5,000 separate documents, but it's all strung together by our computer cloud-based system. If you wanted to add, say, another learning unit out of the various templates that we have created, one would come down here and then add it. And it would look like this. There is knowledge, example or case studies, and assessment. As I said before, you start typing. There is the preview button and the publish button, or the add button. If you hit the add button, you can add extra elements, be it a snippet, text, assessment, questions, or a media carousel, multimedia content. When you're in here, then you can see a moderately sophisticated HTML5 text editor, including things such as tables and so forth, and more advanced interactive assessment tools, HP5 elements. You can also customize certain things by hitting the CSS styles and typing in one of our pre-formatted ones. So for example, if we wanted this to look according to our custom learning outcomes look and feel, there's the text, there's the style, that's what it looks like afterwards. And clicking the preview gives you an idea of what it will look like when finally published and able to be seen by the student. Text, media, annotations, and so forth. The menu that you can bring out or leave, as the case may be. Of course, being the web-based technology, it's also responsive to various screen sizes and also to mobile devices. And here's an example of the mobile device. A quiz, typically, most commonly, is a multiple choice question, but doesn't need to be necessarily. I thought I'd put this one up because this is relevant to COVID-19, which we're in stage 4 lockdown at the moment. Which of the following scenarios is most likely to represent a false negative, a negative COVID test? Sputum sampling from somebody in the ICU who's intubated and previously tested positive. Swabbing a 50-year-old man with new onset sore throat. No epidemiological risk factors. Not refrigerating the sample properly. Or repeated testing for somebody who was previously negative and not likely to be positive based on clinical suspicion. So I thought I would choose this one. Somebody's positive in the ICU because of it, highly unlikely to be negative. So that would be most likely to be a false negative. I click on that, I commit myself, it's now locked in, I get marked, and instantaneously the screen refreshes. I now see that I actually got it correct. There's a green, there's a tick, and here is an explanation. Of course, we may allow people to reset questions, in which case they wouldn't be given the explanation. They wouldn't necessarily be told which one is correct. They'll just be told they're right or wrong. And then they get a random sample of alternative questions when they reset, not the same set. As I said before, we've had about 15,000 assessments per week. And the assessments can bank up. So it's nice to have, say, half a dozen or so rather than just one. Case studies, they reinforce across multiple learning units. They are intended to be interactive and engaging, and preferably exacting of some sort, making one think. Often they do represent what we would normally consider low-level simulations. So a role play in a clinical scenario might be a form of simulation to real clinical practice. But you can simulate that to some extent with e-learning by having a video and then asking the patient, the student rather, a whole lot of questions. They typically look something like this. There may be some multimedia. There is a scenario set. There may be some additional things to do, such as review investigations and so forth. And then you might be asked to do some assessments. Now, these assessments may not necessarily be multiple choice. For example, in this case here, it's a short answer question that's being asked for. And also they may be marked as mandatory or non-mandatory, as the case may be. And finally, there is a navigation portal, an e-portfolio, which allows one to see with larger courses in particular, the various elements of it navigate through. For example, if you've done these assessments, this particular one, Critical Care for Essential Nurses, has 194 assessments, but you might have only done 20 and you want to go straight to the ones that you haven't done yet. This is a way of navigating that, as well as the course itself. I wanted to highlight another aspect of the platform and technology. So normally we would handle about 400 or 500 cases a month, but enter left field, COVID. With the release of our courses and the intense interest in them, you can see that the cases rose to about 2,500. We increased by almost 10-fold, and we coped with that. Now, that's pretty interesting because most organizations would tail off at about double the rate. We had no additional assistance. The medical school didn't parachute anybody in to assist us. We didn't get any extra money. I think this is a testament to obviously the activity of our staff, but also to the robust nature of our platform in being able to handle such an enormous variance in caseload. Blended learning is another aspect which is very relevant to today's world. Blended learning we refer to as typically a combination of theoretical and practical skill learning. And the principle here is you can separate those two, preferably by providing the theoretical knowledge first. And so you have your knowledge and then you come and do the skill. You can't learn the skill by watching a video or listening to an audio tape. You must do it yourself. But also in the days of COVID-19, but generally as far as economics is concerned, the use of simulators is really very relevant, because infection control issues and social distancing are very relevant to this too. But also, if you are able to get to a certain level of physical skill development with the technology and no patient is harmed, obviously that's a good thing. You might find that it's actually an awful lot quicker. And we find in clinical practice, often the opportunities to practice a particular skill, and in my case, coronary artery bypass surgery, the registrar assists me and they say, well, okay, fine, time for you to do one of the grafts. But that might happen one graft and it might happen once a week or so on. If you could do 50 of them in one morning, obviously that makes a great deal of sense. So if we just rewind a minute, what's the alternative? A lot of you may well remember the audio tapes, the cassette tape you put in, a bit like the YouTube videos these days. You run it forward, you think, sorry, too far. I want to get to somewhere else. I'll just go back a bit. I'll back too far. I'm going to go forward again, and so forth. It's a very poor way of navigating a lesson or a tutorial. Lectures and lecture webinars, they're not that much different in some respects. A videotape of a lecture, in our view, is perhaps one of the worst forms of teaching that one can do. It's completely passive, and audiobooks can often be quite interesting, but not necessarily the best learning. And why is this? Well, here's some thoughts. A video and audio tape will progress at the usual speed of speech, which is about 50 to 60 words a minute. Somebody's talking, a talking head at a lecture, for example, and they will talk reasonably normally or even slowly, so that there is more comprehension and more separation of words. Most of the young people these days, well, if they listen to a videotape of a lecture, they put it on double speed, and the chipmunk speaking doesn't put them off, and they can get through it twice as quick. They get to the end. But e-learning, on the other hand, is mostly reading, and that is an awful lot faster. So most people will typically read at about 120 to 150 words a minute, and many will read a great deal faster than that. There's also vastly improved navigation. You get an index, a menu, and so forth. So the most efficient form of e-learning is more than just dry, boring text. Otherwise, it's just an electronic book. It's involving multimedia and any or preferably all of the following: rapid navigation with menus and so forth, allowing rapid consumption, the small bite-sized chunk, the modular element of it, allowing you to jump in and jump out. If you do only one thing, but you've done it completely, instead of you've only done one thing and it's 10% of it, your retention and comprehension is better. The interactivity, there's considerable research showing the more you are required to interact with whatever it is, the better the learning. And automation of systems. If somebody wants to do an assessment at 2 a.m. in the morning, so be it. It still takes the same 0.3 nanoseconds to be marked as it does at 9 a.m. in the morning. So now I'll move on to a little bit of a description of some of the technologies that we have used to build what essentially is a bespoke platform, an e-learning platform from the ground up. The back end is predicated around Salesforce.com. That's really one of the largest CRMs available. It's cloud-based, enormously powerful, and actually not that cheap. We've also been using the Adobe Digital Publishing Suite for some years now. It's getting a bit past its use-by date. It's quite heavy duty in terms of labor to publish to, and by the end of this year we hope to have more or less phased it out in favor of our new development, which has been going on for now a couple of years or so. Roku, most people would not have heard of, is again a cloud-based database. It's a wholly owned subsidiary now of Salesforce, and it allows us to custom build these types of applications that we've been talking about. Of course, there are also a whole lot of other programs and add-ons, connectors, and APIs, etc. Our focus long term is on the devices, your phones, your tablets, etc. We strongly believe that the predominant future of the consumption of education will be people picking up and looking down convenient display devices. No longer will people dedicate a whole package of time on a regular basis to conduct their study. And it's likely that they will have multiple devices, not just one. So it needs to be cross-platform, which is why we've particularly looked at the web technologies as the base platform, which will evolve rapidly, rather than specific custom apps. And we have experience with apps, and I can tell you, updating them is quite a big deal, and web technologies is far more sensible. Apart from the product and the distribution, marketing and sales in a university are often not really considered that important or necessary. But let me tell you, they are just as important as necessary. The only thing to say is the old days of advertising in a medical journal are really gone, a newspaper, etc. If you want to reach the market, it has to be electronic and it has to involve social media. So, of course, we do engage in Facebook and Twitter, LinkedIn, and the like. And we have quite a number of strategies to try and optimize our profile, our exposure, our reach, keep in touch. We also deliver regular free content, which is interesting to try and stimulate that process. Our success with the COVID suite of programs really very much paralleled our advertising campaign. The benefit for us, of course, is that within the space of a few weeks, we just added another 10,000 contacts to our contact record. So we will be spending time on selling, as they say in the sales game. So to summarize this talk, firstly, lung ultrasound, it's more accurate than chest x-ray. It's much more convenient. It's very simple to repeat, and you don't have to move the patient. There's no ionizing radiation, so it's clearly a lot safer in that respect. And learning it is actually remarkably simple. Our e-learning platform, or e-learning in general, interactivity is the key. The combination of text and multimedia is crucial. To integrate the author and consumer platforms into one single overarching platform is our grand plan strategy to try and massively increase our efficiency and therefore be able to drive down prices and increase our scalability. And the automation in general of everything else, including all the communications, will lead to greater scalability. We really are trying to build a platform vastly greater than our current needs require. The blended learning concepts for practical skills are as relevant now as they ever were and ever will be, and that is theory and practical skill can be separated, and practical skills can never be taught without actually doing them in practice. Sales and distribution matter just as much as the product itself. And I thank you so much for your attention, Noan, and I very much appreciate your kind invitation to present to this very esteemed audience.